Who would you consider as the most badass person in history? Definitely Major Hugh Thompson. I'm sure there are people who have done similarly brave things, but not that I know about. In 1968, Thompson managed to stop the My Lai massacre almost single-handedly. He arrived after many civilians had already been killed, and couldn't understand how they had died. After realizing his fellow American soldiers were firing on unarmed civilians, he landed his helicopter between the Vietnamese and the soldiers. He then told the troops that if they continued to do what they were doing, he and his crew would open fire on them. After getting back to base, he filed a complaint about what he had witnessed. His complaint was covered up, and he was shunned as a traitor. It wasn't until 1998 that the army acknowledged he did the right thing. It's common to be brave in war when you know that you'll be lauded as a hero. It's another thing entirely to do it knowing you'll be seen as a traitor. He turned against his troops and country to protect innocent lives, despite what it would cost him, and I think that's about as brave as you can get. He was ordered to attack an encampment of Cheyenne, but ordered his own men to stand down when he saw that they were flying the Union flag as a sign of peace. He later wrote the following in a letter to his friend and former commanding officer. "Do not read if you are at all squeamish. Seriously, just don't. I refused to fire, and swore that none but a coward would, for by this time hundreds of women and children were coming towards us, and getting on their knees for mercy. I tell you Ned, it was hard to see little children on their knees have their brains beat out by men professing to be civilized. I saw two Indians hold one of another's hands, chased until they were exhausted, when they kneeled down, and clasped each other around the neck and were both shot together. They were all scalped, and as high as half a dozen taken from one head. They were all horribly mutilated. One woman was cut open and a child taken out of her, and scalped. Squaw snatches were cut out for trophies. You would think it impossible for white men to butcher and mutilate human beings as they did there. The Canadians did so much badass shit in World War II. I've heard multiple accounts of Canadians liberating towns on their own. One happened to fool an entire German garrison that there was a whole bunch of people behind a couple walls leading into the street. I think it was on a documentary about the Black Watch. Horatius Cocles of the early Roman Republic is also a strong contender. Single-handedly holding off an entire army while other soldiers destroyed the bridge he was standing on. He was so effective that the invading Clusium soldiers just resulted in lobbing swords at him to see if it would work. He eventually got a wound at the arse, called for bridge to be pushed down and jumped into the Tiber, swimming to safety. Another story. From the same conflict, Gaius Mucius Scaevola, who was a young Roman who volunteered to assassinate the king of Clusium, making his way into the enemy camp disguised as a fleeing slave. Unfortunately, due to a mix-up, Gaius killed an advisor rather than the king. The king interrogated Gaius and threatened to throw him into the fire unless he revealed further plots to kill him. Gaius casually walked over to the fire and stuck his hand in without flinching. The king, clearly unnerved by the absolute balls on the kid, just tells him to GTFO the camp. Gaius doesn't stop there though. As he's leaving, he warns the king that there's an agreement between all the Roman youths that they will individually attempt to assassinate him, staggering their attacks by a drawing of straws. It meant that pretty much anyone the king didn't know personally was a potential assassin. The king decided to fuck off and lift the siege. I've read about this recently, mostly true, but the boy did not make a full recovery, though reattaching the arm was successful. The blood loss he suffered caused brain damage and he remains nonverbal but is living a happy life. He was kept alive due to the CPR efforts of the people around him. By wrestling the 200-pound shark, the uncle prevented it from attacking the other children in the water, as well as helped to retrieve his nephew's limb. Totally as an aside, apparently a bullshit accusation went viral, penned by an anonymous source, and ultimately debunked, that the uncle had been shark fishing and chummed the water and had landed and reeled in the bull shark that attacked his nephew. I found an article about this. Interestingly, it was a bit of a group effort, as the uncle prevented the shark from leaving with the limb and potentially attacking others in the future. After he dragged it onto the shore, and grappled with it, a park ranger shot it in the head, and then pried its mouth open. Then a volunteer fireman reached inside and retrieved the arm. It was also his aunt who was giving him a heart massage the entire time from the beach to the hospital that kept him alive. Well, that and 30 pints of blood they had to give him in the helicopter that airlifted him out. The whole Cuban Missile Crisis is a really fascinating saga, and Bobby Kennedy deserves a lot of credit as well. Bobby had a meeting with the Soviet ambassador to work out a deal to end the crisis. Prior to the meeting, they received a letter from the Soviets basically agreeing to all the things the US wanted. Then they received a second letter that was much more hardline and with terms the US likely wasn't going to agree to. So in a stroke of genius, Bobby Kennedy chose to simply ignore the second letter. He never brought it up at all with the ambassador, simply pretended it never existed. And somehow this worked. I love that story. Like, he got the first hit in. With a fucking claw hammer to the temple. And she still overpowered him and killed him. It almost makes me wonder if being in the medical field, and learning how to handle traumatic situations gave her more clarity and control where most people would just panic. Nancy Wick. So skilled as she was nicknamed the White Mouse by the Gestapo due to her elusiveness in avoiding capture. Highly talented in espionage, she worked as a spy for the French resistance and the Special Operations Executive to take down the Nazis. One of the more highly decorated women from World War II, yet not well known. And she was really good at it. Took out several machine gun nests and artillery guns in her first fight. Often her tank would get damaged, she would disregard orders, leap out and repair it under heavy fire, get back in and go back to blowing shit up. This woman's anger toward Germans for killing her husband is legendary. She did this in every battle until she was killed for fixing a tank under heavy gunfire. She finished the job, but unfortunately, the tank was hit with a shell and the crew were killed. She was Leroy Jenkins if he actually was good in battle. That's why she was the first woman in a battalion to be awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, which, as you can guess, is the highest honor you can possibly receive in Russia. She is buried in a place of honor. Galvarino. He was a fierce Mapuche warrior that had both of his hands chopped off as punishment when captured by the Spanish during the Arauco War. Rather than slaughter Galvarino, the Spanish sent him back to the Mapuche to send a message, but instead of causing the Mapuche to surrender, it had the opposite effect. Galvarino decided to have 2 knives lashed to the stumps where his hands used to be. He learned to fight without hands while using the knives as weapons. Less than a month later, Galvarino fought with the Mapuche against the Spanish again. Around 3,000 Mapuche warriors engaged 1,500 of the Spanish on November 30, 1557. At the Battle of Millarapu. Although they didn't win, Galvarino killed several of the Spanish before the army of 3,000 were all killed. Mad Jack Churchill, no relation. On D-Day, he stormed the beach armed with a broadsword and a longbow. He has the only confirmed kill with a longbow in World War II. At one point he was captured, escaped, and later found playing his bagpipes. Dude was a fucking legend. After capturing and escorting 42 prisoners out of Molina, he walked back into town to retrieve his broadsword. He also led a raid on the German garrison at Vagsøy, Norway, while playing the bagpipes. And my personal favorite, on the morning of a raid on the German island of Brac, only Churchill and 6 others managed to reach the objective. A mortar shell killed or wounded everyone but Churchill, who was playing Will You Know Come Back Again on his pipes as the Germans advanced. You feel a sudden pain in your chest. Is this what it feels like to get shot? You think as you look down, expecting to see a hole in blood. Instead, protruding from your chest is a shaft of wood with feathers on the end. Was zum Teufel ist das? You mutter, as you fall to the ground. As you bleed to death, you see the man that must have killed you run past, a fucking madman in a kilt, wielding a bow and wearing a sword. You've been killed by Mad Jack Churchill, and will be vaguely remembered in decades to come as the guy killed by a longbow in World War II. Desmond Doss. An army medic in World War II who was constantly belittled and abused by his battalion and superiors for refusing to use a weapon as it went against his beliefs. Then, when he landed in Okinawa and more than half of his battalion were shredded by Japanese machine gun fire, Desmond Doss crawled through the dirt over the course of several days to as many of his injured allies as he could and dragged them all the way back to the 40-foot cliff they had scaled up from, then lowered them to safety. Some of these injured men were lying 15 feet from the enemy machine gun itself, and all the while Doss wore his medic helmet, which stood out like a giant bullseye on a battlefield where the Japanese soldiers were ordered to kill doctors first to crush morale. In the end he had saved the lives of 75 men, and survived with an arm fracture from a sniper round and several pieces of shrapnel embedded in his body from when he tried to kick a grenade away from him and his men. He is the only soldier without a gun to be awarded the Medal of Honor. Peter Freuchen. He was a Danish explorer, journalist, author and anthropologist. He is widely known for his exploration of the Arctic Circle and discovery of vast areas of Greenland. He was an indigenous rights activist, having married an Inuit woman. He escaped a death warrant issued by the Third Reich for punching Nazis. Received an Academy Award for the Best Motion Picture in 1933. Won the $64,000 question as a contestant on the game show. He wrestled a polar bear and won. And as if this all wasn't enough, he escaped a near-death encounter in a blizzard by fashioning a spade out of his own frozen feces.